All right.
So you start and then pass it to me and I'll continue.
Yeah, no problem. You're talking right. So hi, everybody. Mr. Lee here. This is Mr. Sambolec, you know, the good-looking guy from over at GM. He's helped us a huge deal by showing us the special way to do a certain type of measurement to avoid a lot of problem, which is the being able to measure the pinion depth, okay? In a nutshell, I'll explain to you in class in more detail. If you didn't have this method, you would have to pull that taper roller bearing off multiple times possibly to find the correct shim. There's a shim that sits underneath this taper roller bearing, so when it goes into the differential housing, that'll dictate how deep the pinion will sit inside your differential case, right, where it meets the crown gear. If you didn't have this tool, honestly, you'd have to put everything back together, paint the gears, measure everything, and potentially have to take it apart again, and you're going to run through a lot of headaches. Mr. Sambolec has brought a specialty tool which essentially will allow you to measure the depth. You put the shim in and you would press the bearing on once. That's it. That's all you need to do. Okay? So maybe, sir, you can explain the tool that we have here and what it does.
Sure. So this tool is going to, first part of the tool is this. And what we do with this is we take our pinion bearings, both of them, we put it on here and we install it into the actual diff carrier assembly.
Right.
If you look down inside here, you can see that it's installed there.
Right.
We would torque it to get the rotating torque of what we'd expect to get out of our pinion bearings. So the specs for bearings are, if they're used set, we torque them about 10 to 20 inch-pounds rotating torque. New sets, we torque to about 15 to 30 inch-pounds rotating torque. So since these are used bearings, David and I have set up the torque. The rotating torque on this set is about 12 inch-pounds rotational torque. So it's going to exactly duplicate our pinion sitting in our diff carrier assembly.
Right.
In a perfect world, this is sitting with no shim at its perfect uttermost top height. Okay? So now what we do on top of that is we install the next part of the tool, which sits across where our differential case would go. Okay? One side of it, these two go where the bearing races go. This side actually would go on top of the gauge block, and over here is where we install the dial indicator.
Right.
Okay?
And just to backtrack, just because we did show the removal, he's speaking of this is the outer race. There's one on each side of your differential, right? And those go into these saddles here. That tool substitutes basically your differential assembly, right? And that's in the same center line as the axle, so you're substituting the whole differential and allowing you to measure the depth.
Exactly. So I'm just going to rotate this up so you guys can see a little bit better here. So if you take a look at the gauging block, there's actually 4 positions for it, and they're actually all marked depending on what differential you're working on. So this is an 8.6 diff. Now, if you take a look, there is no 8.6, but there's an 8.75, which is an 8 3/4, and that's the one that we're going to use. Okay. So first things first, we are going to spin our dial indicator off. We're going to rotate this to the correct gauge block that we would need to, which would be that one. And then we are going to lift up and put our block on there. And I'm just going to center it. And I'm going to look at that over there, and that looks pretty good. The next step is to then install our dial indicator. So what's actually happened now is the gauge block is pushing up on the arbor. And what it is now is an exact true measurement of, in a perfect world with a perfect differential case that has a perfect tolerance of machining, that's where it would sit. But what we need to do is measure the imperfection of the actual differential carrier itself, whether it being the side to side or from the exact center line of our differential case and crown gear versus the actual pinion depth. Okay? And that's why we have to do this. So the next step is we are going to take our dial indicator and we are going to place it on top of the arbor. It then tells us that we have to depress our dial indicator to make the needle spin approximately 3/4 of the way back. That just went a little fast there. So we're going to start off there. And now I'm going to depress it till we get it to rotate 3/4 of a turn backwards, which should take us somewhere around there. Okay? Now I'm going to lock the gauge in place. The next step, what I have to do is then rotate the gauge block assembly and find the high point. And what that is actually going to be is the uttermost top spot, highest point between the gauge and the block. So if I keep rotating it around, it looks like my high point is somewhere around here. And now I'm going to take the dial indicator and re-zero it. So now what should happen is
There we go.
when I rotate the gauge block off, it should give me the correct measurement of the shim, which was 16 thou. Okay, so this differential should have a 16 thou shim installed on the back side of the bearing, in between the bearing and the actual pinion itself.
So what he measured was the required thickness of the shim that goes between this tapered roller and the pinion gear, because this needs to be pressed on, okay? Now, if you didn't have this tool, you'd have to use a general, let's say maybe use the one you had in there, for instance, put one in there, and if you measure the depth, sorry, once you put the actual crown gear back in where it meshes with the pinion, if your contact pattern is either too far in or too shallow towards the heel side, you're gonna have to pull this off again with the press, and then try another shim. And it's like trial and error. But this way, you're going to get that right thickness of one shot, then you'd press it on.
And
Pretty
that's
cool.
how it's done.
Cool. One thing we did mention, just because these kids haven't seen it, is about the rotating torque. The tool we use, and what is this tool called?
That is it's an inch-pound torque wrench,
Okay.
but we actually measure rotating torques. Now, the biggest mistake everybody...
Okay, so we had a little bit of an incident. No worries, guys. Okay, so Mr. Sambolec mentioned that a lot of people make a certain mistake, okay? Even initially when I came in, I made that one mistake, is we're trying to measure how much effort it takes to turn this pinion, okay? That determines the preload on those roller bearings, right? What I did was, originally, I put my hand here and I started turning, and I was just looking at the gauge like that. That's not what you want to do. You want to be able to read the gauge while the actual angle gauge, the torque wrench is dynamic, meaning in motion. So the proper way, you'd have to be reading it while you're turning it constantly. So you always try to catch the reading while the bearing is in motion. So he'll do that.
So what we're trying to do is catch the needle as we're rotating. This is the actual rotating torque, which means the actual torque required from your body to turn this. So what we would do is, if this was a used bearing set, which it is, we'd be aiming for somewhere between 10 to 20 inch-pounds of rotational torque.
Mm-hmm.
The wrong way is what everybody assumes is the breakaway torque, which is the initial turn and the deflection of the needle to actually get it to start to rotate.
Right, so you don't read that. You got to read it while it's in motion.
We got to spin it, because the numbers, believe it or not, are different, and if you set the diff up just with breakaway torque, I guarantee you it will explode.
Nice. Okay, very cool. Yeah, well, again, you guys are going to get a lot of practice when we start doing this, but I hope this video just helped a little bit for a reference. And yeah, everybody, thank you, sir, for your time, for showing us how to do this. And yeah, hopefully, as we get through and progress, when we go to the next stage for assembly, Mr. Sambolec will have time to show us his tips for adjustment, just so you won't be here for 4 weeks and not be able to adjust the differential. And my objective is that when they go back on the rack there on the shelf, that you would have improved upon what you found, because everyone's diff had issues. Everyone's diff won't turn properly or binding. Hopefully we can actually correct that so you can learn how to do it properly. All right? Thanks, guys.